Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. There are a couple of things I wanted to call your attention to in this moment. And I would say to you that we are in what I would consider the heat of the chaos summer. Because, as somebody said, who would ever have thought that the biggest chaos agent in the United States would be the president? But here we are, right? So, a number of things happened today that I wanted to call out just so that if you're feeling uneasy about the things going on around you, there's some pattern to them. And I would urge you to remember that currently the administration is pretty much in free fall. And what I mean by that is that there have been stories swirling for a while, but now there are stories in the open, an exclusive story, for example, from the Washington Post, that Trump's war on Iran has seriously shorted the United States of missiles, of munitions. In the first month of fighting in Iran alone, according to reports, the U.S. fired off more than 850 Tomahawks, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, and more than 1,000 of another important system. And that has put the United States in a position of being short on these crucial missiles. So where we are with that is now there has been public reporting on those shortages from the Iran war, Trump's sort of war of choice on Iran. And as that has made it into the media, we have also been getting reports from the White House officials that Trump is furious over this and that he is screaming at his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, about it. Pete Hegseth, you will remember, is the one who's been talking about returning some sort of hyper masculinity to the Defense Department that he wants renamed the War Department, and really just sort of thought that he could go in and throw his weight around and the United States would get control over Iran. And instead, we have gotten mired in a really poor situation. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But Hegseth reportedly responded by blaming his deputy, both for the shortages and for not informing Trump of those shortages, which again, we're in this interesting moment where we have it's almost like all the dogs have caught the car, right? They wanted control of the government, they got control of the government. And now that they don't know what to do with it and are actually causing trouble right and left, what they're doing is blaming other people. And Hanks is saying, well, it wasn't me, it was my deputy, is an extraordinary dereliction of duty there to hold the bag if you've made poor decisions. In any case, what's interesting about this story is there are many different interesting aspects of it. One of them is this misuse or apparent misuse of the American military. Second is the fact that neither Trump nor Hegseth want responsibility for having done this on this war of choice, as I say. But third, and don't overlook this, third is the fact this story leaked to the media. There are people within Trump's inner circle. Allegedly, this conversation took place at that cabinet meeting at Camp David a number of days ago. And this is a conversation that, normally would be kept buttoned up, but somebody is talking to the press, which suggests that the ship of state is springing a bunch of leaks, right? So that's right there of interest and suggests that the war in Iran is not actually going the way that the administration would like it to, even for all its protestations that it is. And even though the rest of us can look at this and say, hey, this has been going on since February 28th, and things seem to be getting a lot worse, not better. On that front, theoretically, again, Trump apparently expected this strike to last a matter of hours. And we are now, it started on February 28th. We're now at the beginning of August and it's dragging on. And again, Trump has had to back away from his threats to continue strikes because it appears he does not have the weaponry to prevent counter strikes. But Trump is madly trying now to patch holes in this story about the lack of the cruise missiles, for example. And last night on his social media site, he insisted that the United States has, this is a quote, massive amounts of munitions, and that large amounts are being manufactured and shipped to the U.S. as needed. And which is interesting because theoretically the U.S. Makes its own missiles, right? And then he called the leakers, said that they should be prosecuted, that they should be locked up. So they are leaking what he says is not true information, and yet they should be locked up. Really kind of frantically maneuvering there. But again, theoretically, we've got these negotiations going on and have had for months. And Trump, as you know, keeps coming out and saying, we're on the verge of a deal. And then he backs off and says, I'm going to bomb them into oblivion. We're on the verge of a deal. I'm going to bomb them into oblivion, in something that looks A, like market manipulation, but B, like just enormous frustration because he does not have a way out. Well, there is more news out today that Iran and Oman, who are the two countries that border the Strait of Hormuz, which somebody described of like an elbow, and that's a really good way to think about it. It's a narrow point through which more than 20% of the world's energy has seaborne energy has flowed until February 28th, and it is and then Iran took control of it, so that it's been able to control what goes through that strait. And this is the primary reason that we've had such an extraordinary jump in gas prices in the United States and diesel prices, which I'll tell you more about in a second. But Iran and Oman have apparently been continuing to negotiate and to come up with a deal, even though the American negotiators have found themselves repeatedly undercut by Trump's social media threats, because every time he says he's going to cut a deal, it's not as good a deal as we had before February 28th. So then the hardliners say you can't do that. And then he says something violent again, and Iran walks away. So because they really clearly have control of the situation here, because they're controlling the Strait of Hormuz. Anyway, the deal that is apparently, and this is very, very, very preliminary, but that is coming out in places like Reuters, is that Iran and Oman are willing to open up the Strait of Hormuz for a period of 60 days for continuing negotiations, but that will not include U.S. or Israeli flagged ships. Again, this is very preliminary. But also that they are talking about Iran controlling one of the directions of the ship traffic through the strait. And on that, Iran would like to have fees of 5 to 7% of the value of the cargo. Now, remember, Trump insisted we were going to do it and we were going to take 20%, which kind of undercut the idea that America stood for freedom of the seas. It was a real mistake when he did that, because now the answer is, hey, you guys were going to take 20, we're only going to take 5 to 7. But that does undercut this concept of freedom of the seas, to which the United States of America has adhered since at least 1941 with the Atlantic Charter signed by FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. If Iran is seeking fees of 5 to 7%, Oman is seeking fees of 3%. So this would be a fee structure that would essentially take costs of 3% on one side, 5 to 7% on the other, and is just an enormous, enormous loss to the United States. And I'm putting it that way and not in any other context, because I'm trying to build this idea of the chaos summer. This is a huge loss for the Trump administration. It's also a huge loss for the United States of America, and a huge loss for the world, because having thrown onto the table the idea of freedom of the seas as negotiable, that's going to be a huge deal for world trade. World trade has depended since World War II on freedom of the seas. That's why goods got cheaper. Now that is no longer apparently going to be the case. So that's the reason I'm putting that there, is because that is one of the things I think that is contributing to this chaos in the White House, is the acknowledgement that the war in Iran, there's no way to spin the war in Iran as a success. Trump keeps trying to say it is has guaranteed that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. And most observers think the opposite is true, that it has made it very clear to Iran that it needs a nuclear weapon because the United States uh, walked away from negotiations while they were ongoing and simply started bombing. And it's done enormous damage to that country, which, Iran can easily say wouldn't have happened if it had a nuclear weapon, which is, we're in, again, as my mother would say, Mel with a Hess on that one. But one of the pieces of this crisis in Iran is the fact that it has driven food prices very high, as have the crackdowns on immigration in the United States, especially undocumented immigration, who many of those people are those who harvest our crops. And at the same time, the price of gas and of diesel, which is what powers the trucks, for example, that get produce to market, and that power boats, by the way, that go out to fish. Diesel is their central means of propulsion as well. That's driving food prices and the prices of goods higher as well. And so increasingly, there is concern in the economy about rising inflation, which has consistently gone up over the course of this summer, that is really pinching people, and they're very aware of it. Now, Trump has been trying to say, and said just yesterday, I believe it might have been the day before, I've kind of lost track of time as usual, that we're in the best economy that's ever been. He gives himself an A+ on the economy. Everything is just ducky. But if you have been to the grocery store, you know that that is simply false. And he is really trying to convince people that the economy is good when in fact it's not. So you've got that hanging out there as well. Now, you also had yesterday, or whichever day he was in Nevada, Trump talking about what he is trying to do around the world. And he started to boast about what he has done in Venezuela, where he said, we are taking billions and billions of barrels of oil and selling them. And again, this is all opaque. Nobody has any idea where this money is going. And then he said, sort of chuckling, you know how this is, to the victor belong the spoils. Okay, that's a complete refutation of American foreign policy since World War II. The idea that we would have a rules-based international order. You simply couldn't go into another country and take its resources for yourself, which was, of course, one of the key elements behind World Wars I and II, and behind wars before that as well. So he has said that that's what he is doing in Venezuela. Of course, Congress never said that it agreed with this, never went along with this. And then he said, and we're doing the same thing now in Iran, where and this is not a direct quote, where he said something like, we're bombing the hell out of them or something. But clearly he is trying to rework the American role in the world as being one of the big dog in the fight, where we just go and take stuff. At the same time that we are madly scrambling, because that desire to just go and take stuff means that we are in what one reporter called an extreme munition shortage because of that. So, there's not good news on any of these fronts right now. And then there's another set of stories coming out. There is the increasing focus on the corruption in the Trump administration. One of the stories out today talks about how companies that are affiliated with Trump's sons have gotten more than $3 billion in government contracts. That's my money and your money going into the pockets of companies that are associated with Trump's sons, even if they were companies that don't have any experience, for example, in drone making. Now they've got government contracts. And this is happening across the board, that Trump's cronies are getting government contracts. Very wealthy people are getting government contracts, people like Elon Musk. And that, I think, shows that concentration of our money in the pockets of Trump and his people, I think really shows in the changes that he's made to Washington, D.C. I think that's why the reflecting pool, for example, is so important, or that triumphal arch, or now they're talking about the car race around Washington. That's our money. That's taxpayers' money, much of which has been taken from the national parks, for example, to work on his vanity projects. And I don't know about you, but I look at this use of my tax dollars, and I'm really sensitive to how tax dollars are used. This is like my happy place is to talk about the way we use taxes, that they are signs of what our society values, and to see our hard-earned tax money going into these projects and these contracts, and the many ways in which the Trump administration is grifting, not only off people of wealth and people who are investing in cryptocurrency, for example, but also off the American taxpayer, is incredibly frustrating and, to my mind, angering. And if you're not paying attention to that, it kind of, again, makes my hair catch on fire when I think about how really carefully in our town we comb over the town budget and over the school budget and recognize that money that people are putting into, some sort of a project is money that they are not putting in food on their table. And that you need to be really careful of that. And to watch, for example, Trump putting a helipad by the White House without congressional approval again, and then deciding that the slope was unfortunate and having it torn out. Those are our tax dollars that he basically just put in a pile and lit on fire. And so that rising anger is there as well. Now, where is this all going? One of the big things that has happened is the attempt of Republicans in the Senate to really make Dr. Anthony Fauci the central story of this moment. That is, Fauci worked for the United States basically for his whole life. He was the guy behind PEPFAR, the president's AIDS program in Africa, which is credited with saving more than 25 million lives. President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for that work. Trump commended his work on battling COVID. And yet there is this real attempt to focus, especially the attention of the American base, but also the American people, on this 85-year-old retired doctor in this moment. So what's happened today, or what happened last week, is that the Senate Oversight Committee that's overseen by Chair Rand Paul from Kentucky, called Fauci in front of them to testify. And just so you understand what's happening there, Fauci in his career has testified before Congress more than 200 times. I mean, he's testified there more than pretty much anybody. He's testified more than 200 times. But he recognizes that they are trying to change the subject, and they're trying to prosecute him much as they are trying to prosecute the former special counsel Jack Smith, who is the one that indicted Trump for retaining classified documents after he left the White House and for trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. So before he left office, former President Joe Biden gave Fauci and a number of other people who were in danger of political prosecutions a pardon. Now, if you have gotten a pardon, that is supposed to mean you can't plead the Fifth Amendment. You can't rest on your constitutional right to refuse to incriminate yourself, because you can't be incriminated because you have a pardon. But generally, those pardons only apply up until the time that they are given. That there's a limit to what they cover. And that's pretty much what legal theorists think would happen here, is that Fauci is protected for things he did before that, but not after. And it's pretty clear that Senator Rand Paul desperately wants to put Fauci behind bars. He has said so repeatedly. And I do want to point out here that Fauci has never been charged with a crime. He's never been indicted. He's never been charged with a crime. They got nothing on this guy. So they hauled him in. He's retired now. They hauled him in before the committee last week. And he gave a statement. And this is after they had found his diary after almost a year-long search on government servers. He was a government employee, so he wrote it there. And they had released it to the public without even telling him they had it. I mean, which, by the way, I didn't actually think made him look bad. I thought it made them look bad, the stuff that was in it. Anyway, he said, I've testified here more than 200 times, but he called out Paul's, and this is a quote, obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his public releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, behind bars, which is exactly what they did to Jack Smith. They asked him a question that he answered literally correctly. And yet they are trying to say that he perjured himself by not answering, explaining that they had made a mistake in their questioning. That's not going to fly. But they're really making his life miserable over that. So what happened today is that the committee itself, on a party line vote, voted to hold Fauci in contempt of Congress. I'm sorry, he read that statement and then he said, I'm just going to have to take the fifth, which is a constitutionally protected right against self-incrimination, because he said, you're trying to find me to slip up. You're trying to make me slip up so that you can get me on perjury. So today that committee voted to hold him in contempt of Congress for taking the fifth. And that now goes to the Department of Justice, which will decide whether or not to prosecute him. But this whole thing, again, they never said he did anything wrong. They're actually sort of trying to manufacture him having done something. And I have to say, I pulled something for you about that, because what I heard when I saw this historian here was the witchcraft trials, the Salem witchcraft trials in the 1600s, in which the accusers looked for any kind of testimony that could incriminate the people that they didn't like. And there's a lot of testimony about that that's really interesting. But I have always most liked the testimony of a couple against a woman that they had had an argument with. And their argument was that, or what they told the court was that after they had argued with this woman, their cows didn't produce milk. Listen to this. We fought with her. The night following, our cows lay out, and finding of them the next morning, they stayed out in the fields, and finding of them the next morning, we went to milk them. And one of them did not give but 2 or 3 spoonfuls of milk, and one of the other cows did not give about half a pint, and the other gave about a quart. And these cows used to give 3 or 4 quarts at a meal. 2 of these cows continued to give little or nothing 4 or 5 meals, and yet these went to a good English pasture, and within 4 days the cows gave their full proportion that they used to give. And you remember that the contours of the Salem witchcraft trials were that these, usually women, but people who were on the outs with a certain group of the community, marked by religious adherence, were forced to talk, usually under some form of torture, to prove that they were in fact in Congress with the devil. And the idea that you could look and find anything on somebody, even in something as simple as a cow not giving milk, is, one of the, I always think about this, when we get rid of the rule of law, that's really what you're coming down to, is the idea that the people accusing you can always find something that you've done wrong. And that's what I see here is, this poor woman who happened to have a disagreement with her neighbors, and the next day their cows didn't give out a lot of milk, and somehow that proved she was a witch. And I sort of feel like when you're in a situation where this person has refused on his constitutional rights to say anything that could get him into trouble, they are now trying to prosecute him for that, not for anything that he might have done that they argue he did during COVID, but for making the cows not give milk. I'm sorry, that's putting two things together, but for not being willing to speak so that they can then incriminate him. And that's, I think, a real sign of just how desperate the Republicans are. that they want to change the subject. There are a lot of people who are still very traumatized. I think we're probably all traumatized, but some people who are still want somebody punished for COVID. And Anthony Fauci is a person that they can make that happen to. And this is a moment. That's a real moment in our history that will be in the history books. That people are comparing it to McCarthyism, which if you had to read The Crucible by Arthur Miller, Arthur Miller uses the Salem witchcraft trials to eliminate McCarthyism. We're doing that same thing all over, and the attempt to prosecute Anthony Fauci is 100% going to be in future history books because of this attempt to demonize somebody in order to distract from the real problems with this administration, and crucially the fact that the American people are turning away from this administration. That is, the numbers and the polling suggests that the administration and the Republicans are going to be in real trouble in the midterm elections. And this matters deeply to Trump, because if in fact real investigations take place in either the House or the Senate, or both, but certainly in the House, who knows what's going to turn up. And one of the things that the Talking Points memo pointed out, I think it was today, is that the administration has been openly admitting that they are not releasing funds to Democratic dominated states, while they are doing it to Republican states. And this is just blatantly illegal, right? And they're admitting it pretty openly. And one of the things Talking Points memo said today is, are they admitting this solely to get away from actually having discovery, because there's something worse in discovery? And that, I think, is a legitimate question. Discovery is when you get to look at the paperwork and have testimony and all that. And this, I think, reflects the fact that this administration does not actually want to have investigations into its behavior. And that brings up the last piece to look at, speaking of chaos agents, is, as somebody said, who would have thought the president would be our biggest chaos agent? But where he is really doing that is, of course, in his attempt to skew the midterm elections. This is a very real concern. And I just want to have on your radar screens that Trump has asked the Supreme Court of the United States to intervene in favor of an executive order he issued on March 31st, 2026. And that executive order had a number of pieces in it. But one of the pieces in it is that it barred the United States Postal Service, the post office, from delivering mail-in ballots to voters that were not on an approved list that the states had turned over to the federal government. And a judge put a hold on that, said you can't do that, because essentially this would give Trump power over state voting rolls and who gets mail-in ballots. He has gone to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to overturn that. And legal analysts say that in any normal administration, this would be a non-starter in August before an election, but who knows with the Supreme Court. So he is once again trying to find a workaround to make sure he can determine who's going to be able to get a ballot in the 2026 elections. So the whole point of why I wanted to jump on today was to say, we're in the midst of the chaos now. As I said, this is going to be a crazy summer. It was going to be a landmark summer that we were real. It was going to be, I just kept saying it was going to be bad. We're in that now. There's chaos everywhere. The people are starting to be aware of what's going to happen with the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP that the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress made in their bill of July 2025. Not a single Democratic vote on that, by the way. I saw somebody last night blame the Democrats for that vote. Not a single Democrat voted for that bill. And you're sort of watching this whole Trump MAGA dream collapse. And out of that, we are getting sheer chaos. Now, the good news is that we are also getting new ways to look at what we want to come out of this moment, what we want the government to do, what we want it to look like, where we want to put our money, and so on. And I really urge you to participate in that and to participate in local elections. You know, all the local elections matter. That's how you're going to change the ship of state. Pay attention to state elections. Your state legislatures matter hugely. And there isn't a state in this union where there isn't a state election where you can make a difference in your state legislature. And there are some states where you can really make a huge difference in the state legislature. And that's really going to matter because of things like protecting the right to vote going forward. So please pay attention to those and pay attention. People always say, I live in a blue state. What can I do? There's no state where there isn't an election that is contested where you don't want to fight back against the radical right as it seeks to take over school boards, as it seeks to take over the state legislatures, as it seeks to take over congressional delegations, as it seeks to take over state Supreme Courts. And then, of course, you have the national elections as well. So please participate in all those things, but also show up for the causes you care about. And it's been really interesting because I've been doing these videos with a bunch of different people. And I've started to ask lawmakers, especially, what do they care about? Where's the place that they want to put their muscle? And it's interesting because a lot of those people have actually been doing work for a long time, sort of off the radar. Last night, for example, I interviewed Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, and I put that question to him: what do you care about? And he said, I care deeply about nutrition. I've been working on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program forever. There's all kinds of different ways we can make these things better. And truthfully, I don't think I would have called him out for that, because you usually see him in the news as being somebody who's sort of in the Republicans' faces talking about different ideology of government and so on. But there are lots. And then I talked to Shelley Pingree, the representative from Maine, the day before, and it turns out her big thing is the national parks. She does a lot of things, but she cares deeply about the national parks and the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts and how we can repair the damage to those. And then, of course, there's Senator Andy Kim, who's trying to push through Medicaid. And those are just three that are top of my mind because I've talked to them recently. Every place you go, there are people working on subjects that you care about. So put your weight in the game, and we can change where we are right now. And just a sort of a personal aside on this one, I'm writing a book, which is kind of why everything's a little crazy these days. And I just spent all day yesterday reading about the people who were elected to Congress after Watergate in the 74 elections. So Nixon resigns in August 74, and then there's the midterms. And in the midterms, basically the Democrats run the table. They flip about 49 seats from from Republicans to Democrats. They take over a bunch of governorships. They get, I think it's 4 seats in the Senate, and a lot of the really pro-Nixon Republicans get voted out too. So the Republicans tend to be less extreme than they were before that. And in the wake of that election, we got the War Powers Act, actually a little bit before that. We got all kinds of ways to try and rein in a government that had run amok. And we also got all kinds of ways in which the government protected the American people. That's when we got many more rights for people of color, for women, and so on. And it not only at the national level, but also at the state level. I mean, it's really pretty astonishing, all the laws that got passed and all the difference that it made. And watching that, what it really feels like we're seeing now is the attempt of this administration to erase all that, to get rid of all the ways in which Congress and state legislatures tried to rein in a runaway president like Richard Nixon. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, this is my lifetime we did this. This is, I wasn't paying much attention because I was pretty young, but literally this took a midterm election, and a lot of stuff doesn't happen when Nixon is still there to veto things. But then we get the election of 76 and we get Jimmy Carter. And then it's just this whole slew of new laws that are protecting individual rights, that are protecting minorities, protecting women, getting the United States out of covert operations the way that Nixon had them in, and so on. And that often I reach back to FDR or to LBJ. Today, by the way, is the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act that I'll be writing about tonight, probably. But this is actually not that long ago. In many ways, we're watching a backlash to it, I think, and and putting the time and effort into reclaiming the state legislatures, the local governments, and the national legislature is really worth it. And in our lifetimes, most of us, we can see a time when we did that and it worked. We just got to get back there again. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.